Greetings, and welcome to our first real set of notes that will dive into actual history and not cover the basics of historiography. This is Section 1, Early Peoples and River Valley Civilizations of Unit 1, Ancient World and First Civilizations. As always, we are going to have our essential questions, or self-test questions as we call them, and by answering these comfortably in your head, you will demonstrate mastery over this topic. Now, this set of notes, this Section 1 set of notes is split into two parts, a part A and a part B, that don't necessarily line up with the paper notes you have because we usually do an activity halfway through that we kind of break these notes up into. But by having the two sets of notes and follow along with these two videos, A and B, you will comfortably be able to finish this unit. So, our essential questions. How did the earliest peoples adapt to their environment? 2. How did the development of agriculture change the way people lived? 3. Describe the characteristics of a civilization and identify examples from each of the early River Valley civilizations. And 4. How did trade, warfare, and migrations spread ideas among civilizations? So, the origins of humankind. Humanity as we know it, what we ourselves are known as Homo sapiens sapiens. Basically, it's a rough translation of one and the same are those who think. And we are thought to have evolved sometime between 200 and 100 million years ago in Africa. Humans first left Africa. We are not exactly sure why, but we think it's basically due to a combination of population expansion as humans proved well adept at combating the environment and hunting and just became overpopulated and always seeking new food. And we quickly started migrating and moving basically all across Europe and Asia and Africa. And eventually we even began to cross the land bridge that crossed over, that existed between Asia and Alaska while these glaciers were holding a lot of the seawater. And that's how humans got to North and South America. So that is basically how we spread as a species. And here you kind of have the earliest known example of a human-like creature, a proto-human, what we'd call kind of an anthropologist would study here. This is Lucy, the skeletal remains of Lucy. She would probably look a little bit more like a chimpanzee than a human in our minds, but she was certainly more advanced than a chimpanzee. And now, as we spread and truly became humans, Homo sapiens sapiens versus Homo habilis, Homo erectus, or Neanderthals, one of the common ones you might actually heard of, we live in this period known as the Paleolithic or Old Stone. And this was how humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. We just were stuck at basically kind of this technology level. These early humans in this time period, for most of this history, were nomadic. We moved from place to place. We had to always be searching for food because in fact, all humans were hunter-gatherers. We would move into a new area. We would hunt whatever weaker or younger creatures or sick creatures we could find and basically we could overpower or kill. We would find and scrape together whatever nuts, berries, tubers, like an early form of potato, whatever we could find, and we'd eat it all. We'd eat it all until there was nothing really left in a given area or it was too difficult to hunt or gather more, and then we'd move on. And we lived like this, like I said, for hundreds of thousands of years in very small tribal groups, 20, 30, maybe 50 people, but that's it. Like that's all the people you would know. So think of one of your larger classrooms in a normal year. That's all the human beings you would know. Not like, oh, that's my class, I know other people. That's it. I mean, every once in a while you might come in contact with another tribe. Maybe that would be peaceful and you would share and exchange stuff. Maybe it would be very, very violent. We do have not a small amount of evidence that early humans did engage in conflict. We do have evidence that, in fact, early humans may have at times eaten each other when times were tough. And we call this time period the Old Stone period because we do know these early humans, these Paleolithic humans, did learn how to make stone, bone, and wood tools and weapons. And this is a pretty powerful capability. We don't have claws. We don't have great teeth. We're not nearly as strong as some of the other creatures that we were hunting or fighting or had to keep at bay. But the ability to create weapons and tools gave us survivability, allowed us to adapt and survive as a species, where other forms of proto-humans like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Neanderthals, they didn't quite make it. Other characteristics of this early humans during the Paleolithic period, we were only able to gather enough to survive, and basically everyone had to work to gather food. Young children would go out and help their mothers gather food, just like the women. The women generally did the gathering, men generally did the hunting. Though one element I find kind of amusing during this time period is women might gather like the berries, but they'd give them to young teenage boys to try because teenage boys were considered kind of expendable. So if the berry was poisonous, there's other males around, but women, as the only ones who could pass on the genes, who could give birth, were kind of a little bit more valued and wouldn't be forced to eat the random berry or plant we found. We do know that humans at one point adopted some form of religious belief because they began burying their dead. And this is a thing that animals don't really do, but elephants have elephant graveyards where they go to die, and they sometimes visit those graveyards, but they don't bury each other. And also, not only are they burying their dead, they're also burying them with things, with arrowheads or stone axe heads. So they obviously developed this concept of a life in the hereafter and wanted people to be armed or prepared for that life. So a lot of the scholars of this time period, early anthropologists, believed that our ancestors formed a form of spirit worship, which we call animism. Animism is a belief. You can technically write about it for enduring issues as a belief system, just like you could write about stone tools as an innovation. But I'm not in love with this one. I would not write about it. There's better belief systems that I can give you more to play with, more facts to kind of flesh out your essays and stuff. We also know that our early humans created these beautiful paintings out of combinations of berries, bone marrow, blood, and all sorts of other fun stuff. We don't really want to know how they got it. And if you want, there's a virtual tour of one of the more famous of these cave complexes that took generations to create. So we lived as these Paleolithic people for hundreds of thousands of years until around 10,000 BCE, between 12 and 10,000 BCE, or about 12,000 years ago. And historians call this period the Neolithic Revolution, or New Stone Age, Neolithic. And this is a major turning point in history. I'm not going to say you're going to have a CRQ on this in the near future, but yeah, you're going to have an assessment CRQ on this in the near future. It is a point from which humanity moves forward, and those humans who embrace this revolution can never really go back. So why? Well, one, there is the invention or innovation or new technology of agriculture, a new way of gathering food, a transition from nomadic, they're not really going to do that anymore, into settled farming. Two, the domestication of animals. We learn how to bend certain animals to our will to make them useful to humans and breed them to make them either tastier or fatter so they have more flesh on them, or guard animals in the terms of cats and dogs. We bend animals to our will. Three, these things allow the development of settlements or permanent places where humans will live. So we're going to no longer be nomadic, right? No longer be nomadic. Once we begin to live in these settlements and we're producing more food because of agriculture or farming, that means not everyone has to always be out hunting and gathering. Some people can specialize in new jobs, Maybe they learn to make tools and that's all they do. Maybe they protect the town. Maybe they create clothing and garments, any sort of these specialized jobs, and they would exchange what they made or did for food. So we're seeing the beginnings of like a type of economy here. And that's really what our last aspect is this allows the formation of what we're going to call throughout the year a traditional economy. So let's take a deeper dive into each one of these elements. It all starts with agriculture. That is the basis of the Neolithic Revolution, is agriculture or farming. Another fancy way to word this is the domestication of plants, or to bend plants or learn how to use plants better for humanity. And basically what this came about is humans learned that if they planted seeds from some of the crops that they gathered, if they threw them at the ground and then cared for them, those plants would arise again in the same spot in larger numbers, and they could harvest them. Now humans are producing our own food. We don't have to hunt mammoths. We don't have to scrounge around for berries and nuts that have fallen from trees that are too tall for us to climb. We can stay in one place and produce our own food. This causes kind of a chain effect of cause and effect, reaction and reaction that build upon each other. This agriculture led to food surpluses, or early societies having more than enough food than everyone could eat in a given moment. And I'm not saying this was perfect. There were still droughts, there were still famines, there were still bugs that could wipe out your whole crop and the village dies. But there were more and more villages that were living and having more than enough food to go around, which will allow later effects like specialization. And you can see these are some of these early plants. Kind of every major area of human habitation at the time had their own plants that they domesticated. Africa and Southeast Asia had yams, what we call them like sweet potatoes. China had millet and rice, rice being the big one. That is their staple crop, we're going to call staple, a staple or basic crop. Every civilization has one. They also had millet. We don't eat millet anymore. Basically, millet is like the worst oatmeal you could ever conceive of it. And then it's probably going to give you stomach aches, and it doesn't taste good, and it sticks in your throat. That's basically what millet is. Hence, we don't eat it anymore. But humans did eat it for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we had squash and gourds in Central and South America. And then the big ones, Middle East and later Europe and huge portions of the world, barley and wheat. From these things, you can make bread. Delicious, delicious bread. And you can also make, which was a staple crop of humanity as well, you can make beer, which is hilarious though it sounds, was literally a form of payment for laborers in many ancient civilizations. Domestication of animals came shortly on the heels of domestication of plants / possibly dogs were domesticated while we were still nomadic. But basically it's learning to raise and train animals in a way that makes them suitable for humanity. We began to round up the animals that we hunted and just raise them. Like, oh, I can hunt this big, giant, violent cow-like animal with horns, and it can gore me with its horns, and that's not fun. Or I can just put a fence around it, and it's kind of too dumb to realize it can break through the fence, and then I'll just kill it when I want to and eat it later. That's way, way better. And then we started to breed these things and trade them from a young age to do things like pull plows or whatever the case may be. This domestication of animals allowed us to use animals for food, of course, absolutely. Delicious, delicious cows. Who doesn't like that? And skins. So we began to clothe ourselves and have the production of like early forms of leather versus just like hide. But also dairy products such as milk and eggs when we domesticated chickens and goats and things like that. And that all is extra protein in the diet, which, yeah, sure, protein is very important for building muscle. Protein is also quite important for brain development, especially in the early stages of a human being. Not having enough protein, even today, in your diet as a young age can limit your brain potential of how much it could grow, your synaptic responses, and all sorts of things. So we're also starting to see a connection here. Well, maybe these early village humans had advances in technology, yes, because they were able to specialize in labor, but also because there's extra protein in their diet. We eventually learned how to use animals as muscle, so we were able to get them to do some of our harder work that we didn't want to do. And of course, having these animals that we could eat also contributed to the food surplus of the Neolithic Revolution. Animals by area, of course, we have the dog gets domesticated right in between kind of the start of the Neolithic Revolution. Then we have goats. Goats give us meat, hides, cheese, milk, all sorts of delicious stuff. If you've never had goat, it's pretty darn good. Sheep again, hide. We can make cloth out of their sheddings. We can make milk. We can make cheese, all sorts of good stuff. Pigs, you can make bacon. Ain't nothing wrong with that. And of course, cattle, which gives you all sorts of things. And then, of course, the most useless animals in the world, llamas and alpacas, which can't even carry very heavy loads because they have tiny little brittle backs. And this is arguably, in several historical circumstances and point of views, one of the reasons why technologically these areas moved ahead and South America kind of stayed stuck at a certain technology level, partially because of their limitations of their beasts of burden. There. So now we can grow food. We can stick animals in the same spot and harvest them when we will. So that's going to allow the earliest humans to build permanent settlements. All of this chains together. All of it comes from that domestication of plants or learning how to farm, that agriculture. So now we had these permanent small villages because the food was always going to be available. We could grow it right outside the village. And this allows us to build new technologies like better and better homes. It allows us, because we're not moving from place to place, we don't have to worry about how much stuff we're carrying. We don't have to worry about, oh my God, we might have to move tomorrow and then move again a week later. We cannot have a lot of heavy stuff. Now we can start to develop new technologies and basically get things that we develop into what's called material culture. We gained access to new resources that allowed us to invent new things. And again, an amazing chain effect here. So here's some early pottery, which makes it easier to heat stuff, to cook stuff, to carry water, to store grain, to hide grain from animals, all sorts of cool stuff like that. And we began to have other new inventions like the plow, which made it easier to farm. We would open the earth up. And if you don't know the importance of plowing, basically what it does is it revitalizes the soil. It introduces oxygen in the soil and nutrients into the soil. It is crucial to maximizing your agricultural produce. We had better hand axes. We created better cloth out of both animal fiber and plant fiber. And we had early forms of pottery, which is used to cook and store food. So all of this is chaining agriculture. Finally, now that we have settlements, we are planting food, we have animals, we have our little villages we're living, you're going to start to see specialization of labor. When different people within a society take on different jobs, becoming more skilled at them. When we were all hunters and gatherers, some of us might have been better hunters, but like most of us had to be at least decent hunters or the tribe would die. Most of us made our own tools and weapons and bone needles to sew clothes together. And because we were always moving, no one had the time to just sit and like, how do I make a better hand axe? How do I do this? How do I do that? But because now we're staying in one spot and some people will stay in the village and make things and others will farm and feed those people, you're going to have better tools and weapons. Specialization can only occur when you have this food surplus to feed the people who are not farming or gaining food themselves. So some examples of these early jobs: stone crafters making stone tools or stoneware. Early on, you might have metal workers once humans learned how to mine or dig and find metal and bend it to their will. Potters who made pottery. Priests and priestesses who interpreted the signs of the gods, spoke to the gods, and then told the people, well, if we want it to rain, we got to sacrifice a goat. And warriors, because as soon as there were groups that were like, well, we're going to stay in this spot and plant, there were other groups of humans who were like, it's a lot easier to like kill the people who plant and take their food than plant ourselves. And you're throughout history going to have this back and forth conflict between the settled agricultural societies of the world and nomadic warriors, right up until about the 1800s when civilization truly wins and kind of puts the coffin nail in the nomad warriors. Agriculture, war, and settlements all required better weapons. And so what you have is a progression as humans learn to make metal. This is a technology called metallurgy. Metallurgy is really any examination of metal technology. So it can be from the earliest types of metal like copper to bronze, which is a mixture of tin and copper, and finally iron and then steel. But the progression of learning how to make these different things throughout human history is known as metallurgy. Societies or civilizations that had metal generally won out over those who didn't. But if someone had better metal than you, you're rocking out with copper swords and copper axes, and someone else comes and they've got bronze, well, they're probably beating you because bronze is sharper. Bronze is better at protecting you with shields and armor, and bronze makes better tools as well. And then, of course, iron is even better than bronze. So all of these things encapsulated together set the stage for the formation of traditional economies. And this is a term we're going to use throughout the year, and most of the economies we're going to talk about are generally going to be a form of traditional economy. They are based on agriculture. For most of human history, most people in a given civilization were farmers or made food somehow. They could have been pastoralists, which is people who have like a herd of goat or sheep and walk them around from area to area. But that is what most people did. And only about 10 to 15% of any society made tools, were priests, were warriors, were whatever else. It took that much labor of farming to feed the other 10 to 15%. And that's because most of humans relied on subsistence agriculture. You grow just enough for your own family to survive, and you have a small surplus for trading or, of course, the always enjoyable taxes. Fun taxes. People did pay taxes in food for thousands of years. There'd be some limited crafts in these early Neolithic villages, and there was limited barter or trade. So early Neolithic civilizations and early river valley civilizations all did barter and trade. A case study of these early civilizations that kind of shows what they're all about is the Bantu. The Bantu were a group of various ethnic groups that started in Africa. So they stayed kind of in the motherland of where humanity was born. They developed agriculture, farming, and iron tool working, as well as pottery, about 3,000 years ago. And as they exhausted resources in their area, as they over-farmed the land and also the desert expanded, they migrated. They moved as they exhausted food supply. And as they did so, they spread their language, Bantu language, and their knowledge of farming and ironworking wherever they went, to these other tribes and other groups. And a really amazing example that we see today of this spreading of ideas, specifically ironworking, agriculture, etc., is that many languages of the people down here, all these different African tribes, we can trace these languages back to the original Bantu. That's in fact how we know the Bantu traveled to a given area in a given time. This spread of ideas from one culture to another is known as cultural diffusion, and it can be a form for enduring issues of interconnectedness, or it can be a form of cooperation. It can also dovetail nicely into ideas or spread of ideas, as other things are spread like religions or philosophies or military technologies or shipbuilding technologies. So keep all of that in mind. Now, typically we would do the what makes a civilization activity here in class as a group activity. So if we have yet to do that, maybe pause here and then we'll pick up a little bit later. But I want you to take a look at the dates of these early civilizations. If we say that the Neolithic Revolution is 10,000 BCE and these are the earliest civilizations, you can see that for nearly 6 or 7 or even 8,000 years, all of humanity were in this Neolithic village. And we wouldn't quite call those civilizations. They're villages, they're tribes, they're peoples, but they're not a true civilization. And that's what this activity is all about. So I'm going to move forward saying we have done this activity, and what comes next? What are these characteristics of a true civilization that differentiate it from a tribe, a village, a people, as the terms we used before? These are our earliest civilizations, and we're going to use them to base these characteristics off of. We have Egypt. We have Mesopotamia, or the land between two rivers. We have the Indus River Valley civilization, and we have the ancient cradle of China. And these are the first areas where true civilization developed. They took the agriculture of the Neolithic Revolution, they took permanent settlements and job civilization, and they built something greater out of it. And that's how we get our characteristics of a true civilization. Well, the earliest civilizations had to begin near rivers. This would be impact of geography, or this would be geographic impact on humans, or interactions with the environment. All of these would be a good EI, or enduring issue here, right? Rivers gave them a reliable supply of water for their farms. If you're staying in one spot and building a village here, well, you've got a lot of people, and people as they eat also produce urine and feces, and that needs to go somewhere. If you keep pooping and peeing in the same area of land, it will eventually sink into the land soil, and you will eventually poison the area here. But if it goes into the river, it gets flushed out, as long as your population is only a given size. And you can always have access to clean water in which you can provide your family with drinking water, and also in which you can water your crops. Animals flocked to rivers as well for their, water, and that allowed you to capture them easily for domestication or to hunt them. And the conditions of these river valleys, which kind of exist on the sides where the rivers flow here in the middle, allowed the farming to be done more easily, ensured that supply of water, ensured that supply of rich silt as the river flooded, and that led to a more easily developed surplus of food. So that's this interaction with the environment, that all of the earliest civilizations existed near water, and that is also where towns would develop and cities developed and all that sort of thing. So one characteristic of civilizations is they have cities, not villages, they have true cities. The cities grow from these settlements. These food surpluses allow for larger and larger populations until true cities have populations that number in the thousands or potentially even tens of thousands. Initially, a lot of these cities were ruled kind of by a group of elders or chiefs, but as they grew too big for that, you saw either one family or one group take control and create a more centralized form of government. You needed this to kind of keep order, whether this was a group that seized power for themselves or were given power by priests or signs of the gods. And we don't really know the earliest origin of this because it's all lost in myth. But a second characteristic then is centralized government. Like even tribes have a chief and he's their government, but we're looking at truly centralized government that have a focus, that have a systemic approach to government law. They have leadership in the form of some sort of king, sultan, pharaoh, whatever you want to call them. They have a set of laws that govern people, maybe not equally, but they govern people, and they coordinate the efforts of people. A centralized government tries to get the society or civilization to work towards certain goals. So these earliest governments formed, one of the huge reasons why they were successful is they controlled production and storing of food. When these early cities have a surplus of food, people might just be like, oh, let's party, let's hang out, or let's, store it, and then it would not be stored properly and get wasted. Well, these earliest centralized governments took this food in the form of, again, taxes and they stored it in buildings called granaries, huge clay buildings that could store thousands and thousands of pounds of food. And then if there was a drought, if there was a famine, if there was anything that would go wrong, they could provide food as almost like a form of welfare for the society so the city wouldn't die, the civilization wouldn't die. They could also use this stored food to pay workers to do huge projects. They could have them build canals that would bring water into the city or into the farmland. They could build irrigation ditches that would cut out from the river and feed the farmlands far, far on either side of the river. They could build roads to make trade and travel easier. And they could build defenses like walls. Walls was one of the first things that cities and villages made. And these are all forms of public works, work that was done by the society, by workers, and directed by the government. These earliest civilization cities were often governed by warrior kings or priests or a combination of both, who relied on royal officials to both govern, help them, and created laws and collected taxes. Early civilizations had a traditional economy. That's an economy based mostly on our agriculture and farming. And here's some great, beautiful Egyptian wall paintings of farming here. We are clearing land for more farming, harvesting, and plowing. So really all these elements here, and these ladies are storing grains and spreading seed. And that traditional economy would also have your skilled craft workers, your craftsmen, who would make your pottery, your cloth, your weapons. Again, that's that 10 to 15% of the population, and people would barter goods. I'll give you a chicken for that stone axe or copper axe. And also in a traditional economy, for large portions of human history, you have taxes that are paid in the form of either food or labor or both. So you're going to be a farmer, you harvest, 18 bushels of wheat. It's basically a measurement back then. It's a big bag. And you have to give 10 of them to the government, or you have to give 5 of them. And then you also have to work building the new defensive wall for 1 week of every month. And you wouldn't necessarily be paid for that labor, or you'd only be paid in some food yourself. That's a part of your taxation. So this is a traditional economy. 4, civilizations have organized religion. And he said, well, Mr. Campbell, you said even the people in the Paleolithic age, they were burying their dead with tools and weapons. They were doing cave paintings of possibly gods or what they thought the afterlife was like. That's true. We know they had a form of animism and spirit worship, but we're talking about organized religions, things where they are capable of building these huge temples, complexes for prayer and for creating happiness in the gods, so the gods would send rain. They would have a class of priests who would give advice and interpret the will of the gods. Most of these ancient religions were polytheistic. They believed in a lot of different gods, river gods, sun gods, war gods, all these different gods that had to be appeased. And early people sought to gain the favor of these gods through prayer, just praying to them. Please rain, please, oh please rain, so my crops don't die in the field. Through elaborate ceremonies, sometimes, like I said, killing animals, sacrificing lambs, goats, whatever. In some dark cases, sacrificing humans. Building huge temples or houses to the gods and creating offerings of food and alcohol and all sorts of other things, nice clothing that would be expected to be enjoyed by the gods. And they hoped that all of these rituals would make the gods happy enough to keep, enemies at bay, to provide the rain in the river, but not too much rain, so the floods would come. They didn't want to be like their village destroyed by the floods. And so this is the purpose of this organized religion, is to really direct the will of the gods and interpret it for the people. Early civilizations had increasingly sophisticated job specialization, that these urban or city people developed new crafts and new technologies that couldn't all be learned to one person and would be learned instead by groups of people, like a merchant quarter, a stoneworker's quarter, a metal worker's quarter. And they would build on the knowledge of each other. And these people didn't grow food. All they did is earn a living by making things. So these are artisans or skilled craftspeople, again, pottery, weapons, whatever it is they're making. And then a new class arises known as merchants. And they sold goods or traded them from city to city. You can't make bronze without tin. Tin is only found in a couple places in all of Europe. So these merchants would travel to the areas with tin, bringing whatever they thought they had that was worthy of trading for tin, and then bring tin back to their cities to be mixed with copper to make bronze, a better type of metal. Out of all of this arises a hierarchy. As people take on different jobs and hold different roles in society, those jobs and roles are going to be interpreted as basically better or worse, or the people that hold them as better or worse. So this is the development of social classes. Civilizations have, in some form, social classes. People were often ranked according to their job. Priests, nobles, and obviously kings were at the top. Nobles is a term we're going to come across a lot this year and next year. Generally, a noble is someone who has a large grant of land and they derive the wealth from that land. Oftentimes, they don't actually have to farm it themselves. They have people underneath them that farm the land for them. They also, in many societies, serve a military role where the nobility fights or are leaders of soldiers. And they pass their name, wealth, and power down to their children. So nobility is inherited. They're at the top usually. You had artisans and merchants who are often in the middle. And then most people are peasant farmers or, unfortunately, slaves. Slavery was very common in these ancient civilizations. Very, very common. Slaves could be sold, bought, everything you know that's horrible about slavery. But oftentimes in these ancient civilizations, people could work their way out of slavery as well, which was unusual for later forms of slavery that you might have more knowledge of. People in this time period were almost always born into their class. We will talk about some civilizations that allowed people to progress, but generally you're born a peasant, you're going to live a peasant, you're going to marry a peasant, your kids are going to be peasants, and you're going to die a peasant. You're born a noble, you're probably going to live your whole life pretty happy, and you're going to die a noble. Your children will inherit your land. They too will be nobles. So this class structure is a thing that will follow humanity for thousands of years. Art and architecture. Civilizations produce art and architecture, buildings, because they're staying in one spot, that expresses the beliefs, talents, and values of their people. So this is the culture that develops unique, oftentimes, to any civilization. Architecture are buildings and structures, and they show that they have advanced construction, like the pyramids. That's an incredible endeavor to build these massive structures. That's showing that they have engineers that know how to manipulate stone. It's showing that they can feed all of these workers. That's a big deal. All these guys building the pyramids, they're workers who are not planting wheat and barley. They're not growing food. That means Egypt had so much surplus food that they could pay an actual army of workers to build these huge structures. That is some serious food surplus. You had rulers who had temples and palaces built for themselves to remind them, the people around them, of the power of government and the power of the gods. And temples themselves, as well as palaces, would often be filled by art depicting gods, goddesses, rulers. A really beautiful drinking cup here made out of bronze. Carved and cast, really wild stuff. Civilizations have public works. Strong rulers, effective rulers would order these to be built. And they're a building project that is built for the benefit of all of a city's people. Now, technically, the pyramids are a public work, but they don't really benefit anyone. So they're not the greatest example of a public work, though they are in fact a public work. Better examples are irrigation systems. Irrigation systems are generally a series of wells and canals that you cut connecting to whatever river your civilization is found near. And in times of flood, these canals will fill up, these wells will fill up and store water for when it's drier. And if they're canals and you cut them right, you dig them correctly so they flow slightly downward, they'll also automatically bring river out to the farmlands so people don't have to carry it by hand. So this is ensuring your crops have a pretty steady supply of water, which will in turn ensure a better harvest, which will give you more food surplus, which will make your civilization wealthier, which will allow you to focus on more public works. Like I said, a lot of this early civilization stuff chains together. They would build roads, bridges, you need bridges to go over rivers, and walls. These projects were very costly and required a lot of human labor, and early humans often died in their construction. We'll talk about a couple examples of kind of the most brutal. Early civilizations have a system of writing. Many of the earliest civilizations, and we pretty much consider it a key to being a civilization, have a written language. It might not be like what we're used to, which is an alphabet. In fact, usually they were pictographs or picture writing, like the Egyptian hieroglyphics were a type of picture writing. All right, but they still allowed them to keep records. For the most part, our earliest examples of a system of writing were used to collect taxes, to measure the amount of grain that was being taken in by the society, was being stored, and was being given out and paid to workers on public works projects. But later on, different civilizations learned to write myths and stories, to write down their religions, to write down the accounts of their rulers, like when they went to war, peace treaties, all sorts of stuff. So eventually, this system of writing becomes not just a system to keep track of food, which is also very important, but a system in which technology and culture can be passed down from one generation to another. So this is a huge element of civilization. The early people, the Paleolithic people, they could pass some of their stories of gods down from one generation to another, but they had to do it orally. They had to do it by speaking their tales to their children, hoping their children remember these. Civilizations can write their lives as they know it and pass it down generation to generation. So once civilizations gained the true nomer of civilization, the name and this label through these characteristics, there were changes that happened within them. Ancient rulers gained more power and they set out to conquer surrounding territories, creating city-states. A city-state is basically a city that operates like an entire country. So you have the city as the initial political unit, and then they conquer its surrounding land and villages, and they incorporate them into one society. And these city-states then said, well, having some farmland is good, having more is better, having one city is good, having more cities is even better. So you saw battling for power and for control over these cities and these trade routes, and as such, cities began to be conquered, leading to the first empires. An empire is different from a kingdom. An empire is a group of territories controlled by one ruler and usually gained through conquest. And a lot of the earliest civilizations we're going to talk about were in some way a type of empire. And we're going to talk about the beginnings of empires, the collapse of empires throughout this year and next. And in fact, empires are a type of enduring issue. You can in fact write just empires are an enduring issue because, well, they are. As time went on, civilizations changed through the process of cultural diffusion as ideas and technology is a big one spread. As migration happened, one group traveled to another city-state, bringing with them their ideas, their gods, their technology. Trade, people were like, hey, that looks like a way better sword than the sword I have. And the merchant's like, yeah, this is bronze, you've got copper, bronze is way better. And they would trade for these things. And then the guy's like, well, how'd you make this? Well, we take tin and copper, and we make this better bronze. So trade and also warfare. If you fight against other groups and their weapons are better, you might try to capture some of those weapons and learn how to make them for yourselves. So all of these ideas that these early civilizations build began to spread throughout their various areas. And this cultural diffusion allowed these civilizations to kind of advance at a pretty amazing rate. So again, here's a great visual for this whole process. It all starts with agriculture. Humans learn how to farm. That is the turning point, the Neolithic Revolution. That allows you to have your food surpluses. Food surpluses allow your new economic activities, and then you have civilization with social classes, technology, organized government, actual armies instead of just people picking up a rock, specialization of labor, long distance trade, cultural diffusion, warfare as cities conquer cities and become empires, and the formation of true empires. But it all starts with the roots of the Neolithic Revolution. That's why it's such a key turning point for humans to learn how to farm to gain that food surplus. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much.